This is an important theme for us as Christians because one of the central teachings of Christianity when we deal with humans and what humans are like is that humans are created in the image of God. And when atheists come along and say, no, humans are not created, we're just a product of of accidents, of mutations, of chance events that have taken place over eons of time, this creates a quite different vision of humanity. And indeed, if we look at atheists and agnostics' positions about the value of human life, we find that many of them readily admit that human life has no special value, no special moral significance, and such. And so we can look at a whole broad range of atheistic thinking and find that. So, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche, the founder of existentialist philosophy, who claimed that God is dead, he certainly believed that human life has no special value or moral significance. Jean-Paul Sartre, one of his followers in the existentialist movement, likewise claimed that life is just absurd. There's no meaning, there's no purpose in life. And so this is a fairly common theme. But it's not just the existentialists and the postmodernists today who embrace that position. Scientific materialists also embrace the position that human life does not have any particular dignity or value. Richard Dawkins takes the position that there's no purpose to the universe, there's no meaning in life, and such. One of the prominent astrophysicists named Lawrence Krauss from the United States, who wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing, where he argues that everything came from nothing. Although it's interesting if you actually read the book, when he talks about nothing, he doesn't really mean nothing. And there's this interesting debate where Richard Dawkins was debating someone, and he was referring to Krauss's book about the universe from nothing and talking about how everything just came out of nothing. And then Dawkins was talking about what it means to be nothing. And the audience starts laughing, and Dawkins said, "Why are they laughing?" And the guy that was debating him said, "They think it's funny that you're trying to define nothing." So he wrote this book called The Universe from Nothing, but here's his view of humanity because of his thinking about, everything's just the product of these chance events and everything came from, quote, nothing. He said, quote, "We're just a bit of pollution." So that's what Lawrence Krauss claimed about who we are. We're just a bit of pollution. If you got rid of us and of all the stars and all the galaxies and all the planets and all the aliens and everybody, then the universe would be largely the same. We're completely irrelevant. So that's a fairly typical scientific materialist view of humanity. We're completely irrelevant. And he started off here, we're just a bit of pollution. So that even gives this sort of a very negative view of humanity there that's going to be characteristic of, in fact, many scientific materialists' vision of what we are as humans. Lawrence Krauss, this same astrophysicist, then later said that love, here's his definition of love, it's the firing of neurons and biochemical reactions. That's all it is. That's all love is. Love is just the firing of biochemical reactions. And this kind of view that human life is not particularly valuable or special is reflected in a broad array of things that happen on the more popular scene as well. So here's a display that People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals put on that they took throughout the United States and also in Europe. In fact, there actually was a court case over this in Germany, and the Germans actually banned this display ultimately from their streets. It's called the Holocaust on Your Plate display. And the point was that the factory farming of chickens, which is over here on the right side of the display, is essentially the same as the Holocaust. So here you have a picture of Nazi concentration camp and emaciated figures there in the concentration camp. So Holocaust on your plate. So when you're eating a chicken on your plate, you're doing the Holocaust. That's the same. There's a moral equivalency there for them. This is sort of reflective then of this notion that humans really don't have any value, or certainly no more value than any animals might have. Now I want to, what I argue in my book, The Death of Humanity, is that many atheists and secularists, despite the fact that when they philosophize, they will say that. They will say human life has no meaning, no purpose, no value. They'll say that overtly. They'll make that kind of argument when they're making their philosophical arguments. But on the other hand, there's a remarkable inconsistency in a lot of their thought because deep down and in their conscience, they realize that human life does have some kind of value and moral significance. And one of the most fascinating figures that I examined when I was working on my book, The Death of Humanity, was Bertrand Russell, the famous early 20th century British philosopher. He's one of the most famous British philosophers of the early 20th century. But there was this remarkable inconsistency in his worldview because when he philosophized, he did speak about humans as having no particular moral significance. So let me give you an example of this. In 1903, Russell wrote this essay in which he said this. It's a fairly long quotation, so bear with me. But he says, that man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. I kind of like that turn of phrase there, by the way, accidental collocations of atoms. That's all we are. We're just accidental collocations of atoms. Then he goes on to say that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. So there's no immortality, there's no eternal life. And then he says that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of the universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Okay, so that's a pretty bleak view of humanity. We're all going to die out eventually in this mass extinction. There's no eternal life, so there's no ultimate meaning of purpose in life. In fact, interestingly, I saw this reflected, interestingly, at a Holocaust conference I went to in Norway a number of years ago, where a senior Holocaust historian got up and gave an after-dinner talk, and he basically laid out what he saw as the history of the universe, the Big Bang, and the billions of years, and then the evolution of organisms, and then the evolution of humans, and then he talked about how we're ultimately just going to become extinguished, ultimately in the past and such. And so then I was kind of wondering where he was going with this, because it's kind of a bleak, it's a very bleak view of humanity, no reason, no purpose, no meaning to our existence. And then he got to sort of his punchline of what that meant for us as Holocaust historians, because that's the people he's addressing there. And he said, our goal in studying the Holocaust is to make sure that extinction happens later rather than sooner. That was his vision of humanity. And I thought, wow, I don't know why he would think that even matters. In his vision of the universe, it's all going to go extinct anyway. We're all just going to die out. What difference would it make whether it happens sooner or later? In any case, let me get back to Russell here. So Russell believes that humanity doesn't have any particular meaning. He says no heroism, none of our thoughts, anything. It's all going to die out anyway, ultimately. In 1925, he, in an essay, wrote even more specifically about what this means for the sort of the value of human life. He said, quote, "The philosophy of nature must not be unduly terrestrial," so not focused on just our earth. He says, "For it, the earth, is merely one of the smaller planets, of the smaller stars of the Milky Way. It would be ridiculous to warp the philosophy of nature in order to bring out results that are pleasing to the tiny parasites of this insignificant planet." In case you missed that, you are the tiny parasites he's talking about here. Okay, and I think that's very interesting. He used that particular figure of speech because the parasites was a figure of speech the Nazis were going to use quite often, referring to Jews and those of what they considered inferior races. But Russell thought all humans are just parasites. So he has a very negative vision, again, of what humanity is about. Bertrand Russell also, when he argued about the significance of morality, what morality is, Russell also argued that because of his atheistic vision of the universe, that morality is just an emotion. Morality is just a subjective feeling inside you. And so when we say things like, we make moral statements like, thou shalt not kill, Russell said there's nothing objective about that. There's nothing out there that tells you thou shalt not kill. But what that really is, it just means when you say that, what you're just really meaning is, I don't like killing. Just a feeling inside of you, just the expression of your own emotional feelings about that particular action. But it's interesting that Russell himself was not able to hew to a consistent view of humans as being insignificant as he's painted them, or that morality is just an emotion. Because Russell himself was something of a moralist. In fact, his daughter, Catherine Tate, wrote a book called My Life with Bertrand Russell, where she argues that he was absolutist in his morality. And indeed, I think there's a lot of evidence for that. Russell wrote that in one of his writings, 3 passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life: the longing for love, the search for knowledge, and unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind. And in his autobiography, he makes that particular position. He sets forth that particular position. So it seems to me that if these 3 passions are motivating him, either he really does believe deep down that there is something to morality, or else he's just letting his emotions run away with him here. So he does seem to understand something about this. He also said at one point, quote, "The good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge," which is very similar to this quote there, slightly different, but the good life. The good life, well, if he can even talk about the good life, that he's making a moral judgment here. And yet he claimed overtly there was no such thing as moral judgment. So I find this very interesting because, again, there's a lot of people who will claim, a lot of atheists that will claim that, oh, everything's relative, there's no objective morality and such. But when you push the right buttons, you'll find that they really do believe that certain things are good and certain things are evil. And they do think it's a very objective thing. And interesting, I think when we're speaking with people who are of secular mentality and either atheists, agnostics, or others who make these kinds of claims, I think we need to sometimes try to push and ask them about things that maybe they're passionate about, like Russell was passionate about these particular things. Press them on those issues and see, do they really think that those things are just some subjective emotion that may be good for them but not good for others, or do they really think that certain things are right and wrong? And so in our society, there's all sorts of things that, I'm thinking about my colleagues at my university, there's a lot of things that they think are pretty important to them. So they're diametrically opposed to racism, and I'm glad they are, so am I. But I don't think they would argue that that's just some subjective viewpoint, that it doesn't really matter. If someone wants to be a racist, that's perfectly fine. They don't think that. They don't think it's okay to be a racist. If that's how you feel, okay, no problem. There's no objective morality, so you can believe what you want to believe. That's not really where they're coming from. And neither was Russell. In fact, Russell embraced pacifism and nuclear disarmament to such an extent that he campaigned against it in Britain and even spent time in jail. He was jailed briefly for his demonstrating against the nuclear arms there. So why is it that Russell thought there was something wrong about nuclear weapons? Well, because he knew there's something wrong with humans blowing each other up. So he does, at some level, believe there is some value to human life. He thinks there is something important about humans there. Even more interestingly, Russell also deep down had a very interesting and complex relationship to knowledge about God. Overtly, he was an atheist in his philosophy. But in 1916, he wrote this really interesting letter to a woman he was in love with, where he bore his soul to her, and he said some very interesting things. And this kind of blew me away when I first came across this in my research. Here's what he said. Russell said, "I am strangely unhappy because the pattern of my life is complicated, because my nature is hopelessly complicated, a mass of contradictory impulses." So interestingly, Russell knew that there was these contradictions in his own life. It's not something that he wasn't aware of at some times anyway. And then he went on to say, "And out of all this, to my intense sorrow, pain to you must grow. The center of me is always and eternally a terrible pain, a curious, wild pain, a searching for something beyond what the world contains, something transfigured and infinite, the beatific vision, God. I do not find it. I do not think it is to be found. But the love of it is my life. It's like passionate love for a ghost. So there's this sense in which he knows inside himself that there is a God, and yet his mind is telling him, no, there isn't. That's not true. It's just like a ghost. It's just like some figment of my imagination. But somehow this longing for it, he said, was his whole life. And then he went on to say, at times it fills me with rage, at times with wild despair. It is the source of gentleness and cruelty and work. It fills every passion that I have. It is the actual spring of life within me. I can't explain it, or make it to seem anything but foolishness. But whether foolish or not, it is the source of whatever is good in me. And most times now, I am not conscious of it, only when I'm strongly stirred, either happily or unhappily. I seek escape from it, though I don't believe I ought to. So this is an incredible admission. And again, this was privately. He wasn't saying this publicly. No one knew this during his lifetime, except her, probably. And so only after, later on, when his correspondence was published, did people have access to this and find out about this. But this is an incredible statement. And I think, by the way, that should give us a little encouragement, too, to realize that the most hard-nosed atheists, and he was one of the most hard-nosed of atheistic thinkers of the early 20th century, one of the most hard-nosed atheists, may be wrestling with things inside of themselves and realize deep down that, yeah, there really is a God, there really is goodness and humanity. Now, Russell isn't alone. He's the one I'm going to spend the most time on, but there's many others who are in very similar kind of positions, it seems to me. Jerry Coyne, who's a University of Chicago evolutionary biologist. He's actually retired now, but he is still a professor emeritus. He has an atheist blog and such. And he also argues very forthrightly that life has no overarching meaning or purpose. In one of his, I think it was in a YouTube video, anyway, in one place he was quoted as saying that there's no special purpose for your life because evolution is a naturalistic philosophy. And he said, we have no more extrinsic purpose than a squirrel or an armadillo. And so, we don't have any more purpose or meaning or significance than any animals. But then it's interesting that Coyne gets all mad when people start pointing out some of the horrible things that are done in the name of evolution. And so, for example, when the Columbine massacre happened in Colorado a number of years back, many people noted that one of the killers there, Eric Harris, was wearing a T-shirt that said "Natural Selection." And so it became really clear that there were some Darwinian underpinnings of his thinking. And you read his journals, and he talks about it even more extensively, about some of the secular underpinnings of his thought and such. And Coyne just gets indignant at people who try to make that connection and such. But then I wonder why he cares. If those people at Columbine that got gunned down have no more purpose than a squirrel or an armadillo, squirrels and armadillos are getting killed all the time. And Coyne doesn't care, and neither do most people. So it seems to me Coyne does understand deep down that there is moral significance to humans that goes beyond just squirrels and armadillos. And also, very interestingly, in his book Faith versus Fact, he actually argues that his form of secular morality is superior to religious morality. After he got through earlier in the book claiming that morality was just an evolved trait, something that just came out by chance processes and such, he then later argues that secular morality is superior to religious morality. Of course, he's bashing religion in the whole book. But that's interesting because that implies that there's some kind of moral standard outside of those two by which you can measure them if one is superior to the other. So he does somehow believe that there is some kind of objective morality that he's trying to measure these different moralities by that are out there. The last example I'm going to give today in this brief talk is Peter Singer. Peter Singer, in his books Unsanctifying Human Life, here is pretty clear about his purpose. He's wanting to destroy the Judeo-Christian idea of the sanctity of human life. In his book here, Rethinking Life and Death, the collapse of our traditional ethics. The traditional ethics are Judeo-Christian ethics of the notion that humans do have value because they're created in the image of God. And so Singer's trying to dismantle those ideas. In fact, I debated Peter Singer on the radio station Unbelievable, Justin Brierley's Unbelievable thing. And the question that we debated was, is human life intrinsically valuable? And Peter Singer took the position of no, human life is not intrinsically valuable. And I, of course, took the position of yes, human life is intrinsically valuable. So Singer denies that human life has any kind of intrinsic value, but on the other hand, he does think that certain traits, such as rationality and such, do have some kind of significance. But he doesn't really have any basis for that as to why rationality would even have significance in his worldview if everything's just a product of chance processes over time, because rationality itself would then just be an accidental process. So I think I've been able to show you, at least from a few examples, that secularists, atheists, agnostics, and other secular thinkers do argue that human life is a cosmic accident. But then I hope I've also been able to show, and again I show this in much greater depth in my book, Death to Humanity, that many of them do recognize at some level that human life does have value and moral significance. And so I think we as Christians can try to press them on these particular points and try to reason with them about the value of human life.